Yes, I would say, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 5, you have this very fascinating story about Ananias and Sapphira. So it's a couple of people who pretend to have given all the what they have, all the wealth to the community, the Christian community, but actually they kept something. And they are harshly punished by Peter and ultimately by God, which means there is a big temptation today, which is the privatization of everything. There is an over tendency to privatize the planet, natural resources, people, and this is called slavery, the body of women, etc., etc. And actually, in the Acts of the Apostles, that's not the way the Christian community is working, is living. You hear several times in the Acts the fact that they were putting everything in common. So I would say definitely the gospel is promoting the category of the commons, that is, sharing resources, putting things in commons, and not privatizing everything. And at the same time, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, you have the counterpart of this, which is Herod, the king. So Herod sits on the throne and he's acclaimed as a god. And then he's immediately killed by God. And that's the counterpart. So on the one hand, you have privatization, over privatization. On the other hand, you have totalitarian solutions, quote unquote, where the king gives the impression or wants to give the impression that he's like God. And that's tyranny. So we need to find a way, according to the gospel, which is somewhere in between, not giving too much to the private sector and promoting the commons, not giving too much to the public sector and promoting democracy, where the civil society has a say in the big decisions that we make together. And I think that's a very difficult path, but that's the path of the gospel today. Well, this, first of all, I would like to say that this Jubilee report is a fantastic document to which a number of good friends contributed, like Jeff Sachs, like Joe Stiglitz, and a number of others, Stefano Zamani, etc., etc. So I think I warmly recommend the reading of this document. Second, I think, if you think in terms of what kind of reform of the financial system globally we could put into practice, there are a number of things that we could do. Maybe the first important one, the most important one, that is mentioned, by the way, by the Jubilee report, is to promote regional financing. That is, you help countries together into one region, let's say, for instance, Western Africa, and to finance projects with a mutually shared currency. So the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and nowadays Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico are thinking about launching this kind of digital currency at the international level that would play the role of the special drawing rights for these countries. I know that the governor of the Central Bank of China in Beijing mentioned this already in 2009, right after the subprime crisis, and said, "Hey, by the way, we should think about this kind of mechanism." I think that one very concrete way to move on and to move forward is to put into practice what is called a climate swap for debt. That is, or debt swap for climate. That is, you say, well, look at this country, let's say Cameroon, for instance. Cameroon has a lot of public debt with a ratio which is nearly 20%. So what you're going to say is that you are going to ask your creditors, do you agree to give up part of the debt or to restructure the debt with a smaller interest rate or with a higher horizon of repayment? And the counterpart of this will be that the country promises to use the money it's not going to spend in order to pay back the debt, that is, the interest rate on the debt, but the country promises to use this money in order to fund ecological projects on the ground. And of course, the forgiveness on the debt is conditional on the fact that the country really puts its promise into practice. But it's a conditional forgiveness on the virtuous behavior of the state, of the government, in terms of ecology. So that's why it's called a nature swap for climate or a debt swap for climate. So there are a number of countries now which are pleading in order to enjoy this kind of mechanism, like South Africa and a number of other countries. And I think that's a very powerful way to very concretely put into practice the call made by Pope Francis. Well, the message I would convey is that we definitely need to think out of the box today. So conventional economics is good, but it's not enough. It's not enough for the very complicated world we are in today. We need a complex, systemic thinking for economics using big models. I'm working on these kind of models, but also using the experience of poor people on the ground because they know what's happening on the ground. And economists, in the ivory tower in Washington or in Paris have no idea about what's really happening on the ground. That climate change is going to destroy a lot of infrastructures, through floods, droughts, etc., and global warming. But there is also a big other problem, which is the growing scarcity of a number of natural resources, like fresh water, and also like the number of minerals. And so we need to think systematically, out of the box, a new type of economy which is rooted in the care for the planet and for the poor, where we pay attention to a low-tech type of industry which does not consume too much energy, too much water, too much natural resources, and which provides what is necessary, what is vitally necessary to the people, especially in the South, using new financing mechanisms like the one I mentioned earlier, you know, debt swap for climate, you know. So that's why I would say we need to understand the conventional mechanisms, and at the same time, we need to invent new types of institutions which can solve the problems. Because you cannot solve the problems with the ideas that have created the problem.